Paul McCartney has finally spoken, and what he's just admitted about George Harrison has stunned even lifelong Beatles fans. For decades, their bond was seen as unbreakable, the quiet Beatle and the perfectionist, brothers in sound and soul. But the truth, Paul now admits, was far messier. Behind the laughter and the long hair was a rivalry that nearly destroyed them both. During the glory years, George smiled through it all. Through Paul's control in the studio, through the endless delays to record his own songs, through being told what to play on his own guitar. Fans never saw the resentment brewing behind those sessions. They saw friendship. But George saw something else, a man who wouldn't let go of power, even when it came at the cost of their friendship. And now, all these years later, Paul's confession reveals what really happened in those final days between them. The words George left behind, the moment Paul realized too late what fame had done to them, and why, for the first time in his life, he says he's haunted by silence more than any song he ever wrote. The cracks began quietly, long before the world noticed. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were no longer four boys chasing a dream, but four men fighting for control over what that dream had become. Paul, driven by precision and fear that the band was slipping, began taking charge of the studio, writing, arranging, even dictating how others should play. For a while the others tolerated it, but for George Harrison it was suffocating. Inside Abbey Road, what had once been laughter and shared cigarettes became cold silence. Paul's perfectionism, once admirable, now came across as dominance. During the sessions for Let It Be, the tension reached its peak. Paul, trying to hold the group together after John's growing distance, pushed harder than ever. He corrected bass lines, adjusted harmonies, and criticized George's guitar phrasing in front of everyone. To Paul, it was about saving the music. To George, it was humiliation. The cameras rolled during one infamous exchange. Viewers would later see it in the Let It Be film. Paul, calmly explaining what he wanted while George sat still, his face expressionless. But behind that composure, there was rage. When George muttered, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all," it wasn't sarcasm. It was surrender. In that moment, something between them broke, something that even decades of friendship couldn't fully repair. When George walked out of the studio days later, it wasn't impulsive. It was liberation. He told the others he was leaving the band, and for nearly a week, no one knew if he'd come back. The press never heard about the full extent of it at the time, but those inside Abbey Road said the atmosphere was electric with anger. Paul tried to move forward, as though nothing had happened, recording overdubs and planning the next steps, but even he couldn't ignore the truth. The unity that had built the Beatles was fading before his eyes. John Lennon once said George's frustration had been ignored for too long, that Paul saw himself as the leader and George as a sideman. For years that hierarchy was accepted, but George had grown both musically and spiritually. He'd written songs like While My Guitar Gently Weeps and Something, pieces that proved he was more than the quiet one. Yet Paul still questioned him, sometimes re-recording parts himself. It wasn't malice, it was habit. Paul couldn't stop directing, and George couldn't keep forgiving. As sessions dragged on, so did the bitterness. Yoko Ono's presence changed the dynamic further, but for George, the issue wasn't John's new partner. It was Paul. Every note, every take, felt like another test of patience. He confided to friends that he felt trapped, in the band, in the role, and in Paul's shadow. And though Paul later claimed he never meant to push George away, by 1969, the damage was done. When Abbey Road was finally completed, the public hailed it as genius. But inside the studio, the air was heavy with unspoken resentment. Paul's perfectionism had helped shape one of the greatest albums ever recorded, yet it also marked the end of their brotherhood. George's walkout wasn't just a protest against Paul's control, it was a cry for respect, and while he eventually returned to finish the record, The trust between them never truly recovered. Paul would later admit that he didn't understand how deeply his behavior had hurt George. At the time, he saw himself as the one holding everything together. Only years later did he realize that his grip had strangled what made them special. That friendship can't survive when one person refuses to share the space. And that's when the rivalry quietly began to shift, from music to legacy, from friendship to competition. Because when the Beatles finally split, George didn't just walk away from the band, he walked away from Paul. When the Beatles' breakup became public in 1970, it wasn't just the end of a band, it was the beginning of a quiet war. Fans saw 4 solo careers blossoming at once, but behind the scenes old wounds resurfaced in new ways. George Harrison had spent years being overshadowed, and now, with no one controlling his sound, he unleashed it all in All Things Must Pass. The triple album stunned the world, and it stunned Paul McCartney most of all. Critics called it a masterpiece, some even suggesting that George had finally outshined his former bandmates. For a man who'd spent most of his career waiting for Paul and John to notice him, it was vindication. For Paul, it was complicated. He congratulated George publicly, but privately he couldn't help noticing how George's songs filled the airwaves, while his own solo debut, McCartney, received mixed reviews. The unspoken rivalry had switched sides. George was no longer in Paul's shadow. For the first time, Paul was in his. The tension deepened with every interview and every lyric that hinted at buried resentment. George, who had once been soft-spoken, began to speak more freely about how difficult Paul had been to work with. He described the recording process as suffocating, saying it felt like a dictatorship. Paul, meanwhile, brushed off the comments with his usual charm, but those close to him said the words stung. He had always prided himself on unity, and now the one person he had underestimated most was leading without him. In the early 70s, when George organized the concert for Bangladesh, Paul refused to participate. The reasons were never made fully clear. Some said it was due to management disputes, others claimed old grudges lingered. Whatever the truth, it was a missed chance to mend the friendship. While George earned praise for his humanitarian work, Paul was painted by some as distant and self-absorbed. The press loved the contrast. George the spiritual soul, Paul the perfectionist businessman. It wasn't fair to either of them, but the image stuck. Even their music began to talk for them. Paul's Too Many People carried lyrics that many believed were aimed at his former bandmates, while George's Wah Wah sounded like a bitter farewell to the chaos of Beatle life. Each man was healing through melody, yet each song reminded the other of how deep the divide ran. Fans chose sides, unaware that beneath the rivalry was something neither could admit: heartbreak. They had been through the most intense years of their lives together, and now they were pretending the other didn't matter. Paul later said that part of him admired George's independence, even if it was painful to watch. But admiration and envy are hard to separate. When George's solo tours drew crowds that rivaled Paul's, the competitive spark reignited. Yet they still couldn't bring themselves to confront each other honestly. Every reunion conversation, every industry event, was polite but distant. Old memories hung between them like unspoken apologies. There were moments when the press tried to stir them into open conflict, but both resisted. They knew too well what fame could do. Still, Paul's interviews often carried subtle corrections, reminders of who had written what, who had led the band, and George, with his dry wit, would fire back without raising his voice. Theirs wasn't a feud fought with insults. It was fought with omission, with the quiet sting of indifference. As years passed, George found peace in solitude, while Paul sought it in productivity. George built gardens and wrote songs about enlightenment. Paul toured relentlessly, chasing the thrill of the crowd. Both were searching for meaning after losing what had once been everything. Yet even then, each knew the other was the only person who truly understood what it had cost them. And that's what made the next part of their story so tragic. because when illness entered George's life, it forced Paul to face the one truth he had avoided for decades. He might not have much time left to make things right. By the mid-70s, George Harrison had already begun to live in a different world, one that no longer revolved around charts, sales, or headlines. Fame had never suited him. The noise, the constant comparisons, the never-ending shadow of the Beatles, all of it felt hollow. While Paul McCartney was building a new empire with wings, George was building something else entirely: peace, meditation, Hare Krishna chants, and the quiet life at Friar Park became his escape. But that pursuit of serenity also widened the gulf between him and Paul. To Paul, George's detachment looked like apathy. He couldn't understand how someone could turn away from the very machine that had made them legends. Paul still lived by rhythm and schedule, recording, touring, controlling every detail. George, by contrast, had stopped chasing. He wrote songs about letting go, about love and surrender, while Paul still sang about momentum and motion. What had once been a creative balance between them now felt like a philosophical divide. Friends noticed the difference whenever they crossed paths. Paul spoke quickly, always planning the next move. George spoke slowly, as if he'd already found what Paul was still looking for. But underneath George's calm exterior was a wound that meditation couldn't completely heal. He still felt that Paul had never respected his artistry. Even after All Things Must Pass, even after global acclaim, George sensed that Paul saw him as the junior partner, talented, but not essential. It wasn't just pride, it was years of feeling unseen. Paul, meanwhile, had become the de facto keeper of the Beatles' image. Every documentary, every reunion project, every archive release had his fingerprints on it. He wanted to protect the legacy, or, as George sometimes felt, to control it. George once remarked privately that Paul treated the Beatles as his band. Those who knew both men said George's tone wasn't angry, just resigned. He had stopped fighting Paul's control because he knew Paul would never stop needing it. The irony was that both men misunderstood each other completely. Paul saw George's distance as indifference, when in truth, George was trying to save his soul. George saw Paul's control as arrogance, when it was really insecurity. Paul couldn't sit still, because silence reminded him of everything that had gone wrong. George embraced silence because it was the only thing that made sense after so much chaos. They were two sides of the same coin, both haunted by the same band, both trying to escape it in opposite ways. Occasionally, fate threw them back together. They would appear in the same interviews, share a stage at charity events, or speak briefly over the phone. The exchanges were polite, almost warm, but always careful. George kept a gentle distance, unwilling to reopen old wounds. Paul, for all his optimism, knew that no amount of charm could rewrite the past. When George faced a brutal attack in his home in 1999, Paul was shaken. He visited quietly, without cameras or fanfare. Friends said Paul's voice cracked when he asked how George was doing, and George, frail but steady, simply smiled and said, "I'm still here." It was the kind of moment that said more than any apology could. But the old dynamic lingered, Paul wanting to fix things, George wanting peace. Still, something in Paul began to shift after that visit. For decades he'd defined himself by control. Yet seeing George so fragile reminded him that some things can't be managed, edited, or rehearsed. Mortality made everything suddenly real. The arguments, the pride, the competition, they all seemed small compared to the quiet strength of the man who had once been the quiet Beatle. And that's when Paul realized that time was running out, that the brother he'd fought, ignored, and envied might be slipping away before he could say the one thing that mattered most. By the late 90s, George Harrison's health was fading. The news was quiet at first, whispered between close friends, never publicized. Those who had known him best said he didn't want sympathy. He wanted calm, privacy, and a life far removed from the world that had taken so much from him. But for Paul McCartney, the silence was unbearable. For years he had carried guilt like a secret melody that wouldn't stop playing. Now, with time running out, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Paul reached out, cautiously. Old wounds made it hard to know how George would respond. Their history was heavy, decades of rivalry, pride, and half-spoken forgiveness. At first, George resisted. He didn't want pity visits, didn't want to reopen what had already been said and done. But those closest to him urged him to see Paul one last time. Reluctantly, George agreed. And so, after years of distance, the two men who had once shaped the sound of a generation found themselves face to face again. When Paul arrived at George's home, the air was heavy with memory. Friar Park, the estate that had once echoed with laughter and late-night jam sessions, now felt quiet, almost sacred. Paul later described it as one of the most emotional moments of his life. George was thin, tired, but still sharp. He greeted Paul with that familiar half-smile that always made forgiveness feel possible, even when it wasn't fully there yet. For a moment, the years between them vanished. They were just two boys from Liverpool again, sitting in a room filled with ghosts. They talked about small things first: family, music, gardens, guitars. But beneath the surface, they both knew what this visit really was: closure. Paul tried to apologize in his own way, not through words but through presence. He didn't bring up the fights, the missed calls, or the interviews that had hurt. He didn't have to. George knew. The silence between them said everything. At one point, Paul reached for George's hand. It was a rare gesture, one that caught George off guard, and for a brief second, it seemed as if the years of tension dissolved into something purer, a bond neither fame nor bitterness could ever erase. Friends who were close to George later said that he appreciated Paul's visit, even if he didn't say much about it. That was his way. Quiet, understated but deeply felt. George's wife, Olivia, described how moved he was after Paul left, saying there was a lightness in him that hadn't been there in weeks. Paul, on the other hand, left the house changed. He had seen the man he once fought against reduced to fragility, and it shook him. It made him realize that the anger he'd held onto all those years had cost him far more than any argument ever won. When George passed away in 2001, Paul was inconsolable. He tried to put on a brave face in public, speaking softly to reporters, calling George his baby brother. But behind that calm, there was guilt. The kind that comes only when you realize how much love was left unspoken. For years, Paul had wanted to believe that their friendship would find its way back naturally. Now he knew that time had run out. That final visit haunted him. He replayed it in his mind over and over. The smile, the silence, the sense that it wasn't enough. It wasn't forgiveness he needed. It was acknowledgement. A way to tell George that he had always been more than the quiet Beatle, more than the man in the background. He had been Paul's equal, the one person who could challenge him, frustrate him, and still somehow complete him. And in the years that followed, Paul finally began to speak, not with bitterness or guilt, but with reverence. Because the truth he had avoided for decades could no longer be hidden. George Harrison was the one person Paul McCartney could never replace. In the years after George Harrison's passing, Paul McCartney carried on as he always had, working, writing, touring. But something in him had changed. The confidence that once defined him had softened. His interviews, once filled with quick wit and restless energy, began to carry pauses, moments when he seemed lost in memory. When George's name came up, Paul's face would tighten, his voice drop. He never said much, but the weight behind those few words said everything. He once described George as brave and a lovely man, but those who knew Paul best said that was his way of holding back emotion. The truth ran deeper. He regretted the silences, the years of pride, the walls built out of ego. What haunted Paul wasn't that they had argued, it was that they had wasted so much time pretending they hadn't. Fame had made honesty hard. Within the Beatles, every conversation felt public, every reconciliation a headline, so they had learned to keep things inside. But when George was gone, Paul realized that silence can echo louder than any song. There's a clip, often replayed by fans, where Paul recalls visiting George near the end. He says they held hands for a long time. The words are simple, but the look on his face betrays something raw. It's the look of a man realizing too late how fragile forgiveness really is. For all their rivalry, Paul never stopped loving George. But love, he learned, isn't always expressed through harmony. Sometimes it's buried under frustration, jealousy, and the fear of losing control. In private moments, Paul began to honor George in the only way he knew how, through music. He would mention him between songs on stage, speak of him fondly to fans, even hum George's melodies under his breath during sound checks. It wasn't guilt anymore, it was reverence. A quiet acknowledgement that the man he had once tried to outdo had, in some ways, surpassed him, not in fame, but in peace. As the years passed, Paul started to tell more stories about their time together, not the glossy ones from documentaries, but the real ones. The laughter in the vans, the endless cigarettes, the nights spent arguing over chords that didn't matter. He said those were the moments he missed most, the small, ordinary fragments that fame had stolen from them. And though he never said it outright, his tone always carried the same message: he wished he'd said sorry sooner. George had once joked that Paul liked to run everything. It was meant as a tease, but Paul knew there was truth in it. Control had always been his way of coping, with loss, with chaos, with life itself. But George's passing forced him to confront something he couldn't fix or direct: the finality of time. No amount of melody could rewrite the silence between them. In interviews today, when Paul is asked about George, he smiles softly and says, "I miss him." It's a simple phrase, almost understated, but for a man who built his life on words and rhythm, it means more than any lyric he ever wrote. The rivalry, the tension, the pride, all of it faded. What remains is memory. Two boys from Liverpool who dreamed big, fought hard, and loved each other in ways neither could say out loud. And maybe that's the real tragedy behind the legend, that in chasing perfection, Paul nearly lost the one person who made him whole. But it's also the redemption. Because in the end, Paul McCartney didn't just break his silence for the world to hear, he broke it for himself. For more emotional stories, check out this video.